Beggar's barn, they laughed. Sure, it would collapse by the first snow. It would save every one of them before that winter was through. Kansas Territory. The fall of 1887. The ground had barely settled over her father's grave when the family's holdings were carved up on a kitchen table under a sky the color of ash. There was no formal reading of any will, only a room full of men deciding, the way men on that frontier so often decided things, that the eldest son took what mattered and everyone else could be grateful for the leavings. Warren, her half-brother, walked away with the herd, the deep well, the good house with its stone chimney, and every acre their father had spent 30 years coaxing into pasture. Litonya, already widowed, with a boy not yet 7 pressed against her skirts, received $15, a mule with more years on it than sense, a wagon with a cracked axle, and a stretch of gravel and sage north of the draw that nothing living had ever bothered to call home. Warren did not trouble himself to look ashamed about any of it. A woman's claim, he informed the room, arms folded, was a courtesy extended, never a right owed, and a widow's claim less than that. He pushed the coins across the table with 2 fingers, the way a man feeds a dog he doesn't much care for charity. He named it for a woman who should have married better the second time and hadn't bothered to try. Her son Kai tugged at her sleeve. Was Uncle Warren taking grandfather's house too? Litonya let the question hang unanswered in the cold kitchen air. She had learned in the 2 years since her husband died that some questions were kinder left open than answered honestly. She did not argue with Warren. She did not raise her voice, did not demand what another kind of daughter in another kind of family might have demanded. She swept the coins into the pocket of her dress, lifted her father's weather-worn ledger off the shelf where it had sat untouched since the funeral, and walked out into the yard without once looking back at the house that had raised her. Behind her, faint through the closing door, Warren was already telling a hired man that the girl would be selling that worthless ground back to him inside a month. Mark it down and see. The land waiting past the draw did not pretend to be generous. Dry gravel spread in every direction the eye could reach. Sagebrush clung stubbornly to whatever thin soil the wind hadn't yet stolen. No house stood there, no barn, not so much as a dependable well, nothing but open ground beneath an open sky, with winter already breathing down from the north a bare 2 months off. The old mule leaned into its harness and dragged the wagon over baked, unforgiving earth, one groaning wheel at a time, while dust rose behind them like something following at a careful distance. From the crest of a low rise, Litonya could still make out her father's homestead far in the distance, smoke curling lazy from its chimney, the barn roof straight and sound, cattle grazing fat along the creek bottom. Everything he had built in a lifetime now belonged to a man who had never once split a rail to help build it. She climbed down and walked a slow, deliberate circle around the bare acreage that was, as of that cold morning, entirely her own. $15 sat folded in her pocket, worn soft at the crease, all ready from handling. Kai stood beside the wagon wheel, watching her with the particular gravity only a child that age can manage, and wondered aloud whether they were going back. She followed his gaze toward the distant farmhouse, a long moment, then looked down at the cracked gray ground beneath her own boots, feeling its coldness even through leather. We build here. 2 words, quiet and unhurried, and the matter was entirely settled between them. A problem announced itself before she had driven a single stake into the earth. The general store in town, kept by a cautious, not unkind man named Hollis Bell, priced a modest frame cabin, boards, nails, a stovepipe, tar paper, at something north of $130. Litonya had 15. Hollis slid his account book across the counter so she could see the arithmetic plainly for herself, and neither of them needed to add anything further to it. Back at the draw, she tried other paths. A patch of grass greener than its neighbors suggested water lying close beneath the surface, and she spent most of a long day digging toward it with a borrowed spade, only to watch one wall of the hole cave inward and swallow half a morning's labor. She cut sod near the water. Next, the first square lifted clean and whole, the second crumbled apart in her hands. Dry roots, too, starved to hold the soil together anymore. Kai gathered sticks no thicker than his own fingers and stacked them with great seriousness near the wagon. A stray dog that had attached itself to the boy somewhere along the road, Litonya let him keep it, and Kai had named the animal Scout, dragged home a root nearly as long as his own body, prouder of the find than the situation strictly warranted. She lifted the best brick of sod she had managed to cut and turned it over slowly in her hands, watching one crack spread quietly into another until the whole piece crumbled and fell apart at her boots. For a long moment, only the wind moved across that empty stretch of ground, and neither of them had anything to say to it. If this story is speaking to you, consider becoming a member of this channel. Tap Join beside the channel name. It costs little, and it keeps stories like hers coming. A few days later, a rider came out to look over the claim for himself. Josiah was a carpenter who had framed cabins across 3 counties and prided himself by his own quiet account on never laughing at a problem before he had finished measuring it properly. He sat his horse a good while, studying the broken axle, the tired mule, the boy, the dog, and finally the bare stretch of ground where a house should have already stood before he got to what he had ridden out to say. A family cabin needed real studs, tar paper, a roof pitched sharp enough to shed real snow, tight chinking at every seam, anything short of that, and a Kansas winter would find every crack a careless man left standing open for it. Litonya listened without interrupting once. When she let him know what remained of her $15, Josiah took off his hat and rubbed the back of his neck, the particular way men do when there is no gentle way left to say a hard thing. Sell the land, he urged her. Warren would buy it back sooner or later, regardless, and she could work through the worst of the winter in town and start again clean come spring. Scout settled himself against Kai's legs, blocking some small part of the wind with his own body, and Josiah's gaze lingered there a moment longer than it needed to. A child doesn't much care for pride once the cold finds its way into him, he warned. Quiet. Then, softer still, almost regretting the words before they had fully left him. She might be right in her heart and still lose that boy by morning all the same. Nothing in Litonya's face changed at hearing it. But long after Josiah had ridden back toward town, the sentence stayed lodged in her the way a splinter stays under skin a person can't quite reach to draw out. She went back to her father's old homestead once more after that, not to plead with anyone, only to buy what she needed plainly. Cattle moved through the pasture near the creek. Wagons stood beside the barn just as they always had. From a distance, nothing about the place had changed at all, except who now claimed to own every piece of it. She crossed the yard, stopped near the grain shed, and pressed Warren directly on whether she might buy some straw from him, or hay, whatever little he could spare her. His laugh came easy and contemptuous. The straw belonged to him, he reminded her, sweeping one arm wide. The cattle belonged to him. Everything in sight belonged to him now, every last blade of it. If she meant to go on chasing another one of her dreams, he went on, she would do better, spending less time staring at the wind, like it owed her something personal. Father had spent years cleaning up after people who wouldn't listen to reason, and he for one had no intention of starting that habit again on her account. Then he kicked over a pile of weathered straw bundles lying behind the barn, most of it damp through and half rotted. That was her portion now, he finished, fit for a beggar, better than anything she truly deserved from him. Kai watched everything from beside the wagon, very still. Scout let out a low growl that Warren chose deliberately not to hear. Litonya gave nothing back at all. She bent down, gathered the discarded straw one careful armful at a time, and kept gathering it while the men mending fence nearby slowed their hammers to watch, and Warren's laughter trailed her all the way back to the wagon. Build with that, he flung after her, if she still wanted to play at the whole idea. By the time she had loaded the last of the bundles, the straw weighed almost nothing at all against her arms, and yet when she set it down beside her father's ledger that evening, it felt heavier somehow than anything else she owned. Night settled over the draw long before Litonya thought about sleeping. With no walls yet standing between them and the weather, she and Kai huddled together inside the broken wagon bed, a lantern burning low on a crate at their side. She opened her father's ledger flat across her knees. Page after page carried his careful, patient hand. Rainfall counts, winter temperatures, notes on the herd, on fuel, on hard seasons weathered and survived, decades of one man watching this land closely and writing down faithfully whatever it chose to teach him that year. One line appeared again and again across different years, in different ink, as though he had needed the reminder of it more than once in his own life. Wind steals what it can touch. She read the line a second time, slowly, then turned to look at the pile of ruined straw sitting silver under the rising moon beside the wagon. Something in the sight of it tugged loose an old memory, winter nights, as a girl snowbanked deep against the outer walls, frost blooming thick on any glass they had, and yet deep inside a straw-packed loft, the cold had always seemed to lose its nerve, well before it reached her. She reached over and pulled a single stalk apart between her fingers. The stalk broke clean in two. The center was hollow straight through. She tried a second stalk and a third, and found the same each time. Tiny chambers, tiny still pockets, holding nothing at all but trapped, motionless air. She rolled the stalk slowly between her fingers, a long while, turning the idea over the same careful way. A straw-stuffed pallet had always slept warmer than bare boards ever could. A loft packed floor to rafter with it held its gathered heat long after any fire had burned down to quiet coals. It was not excitement she felt, turning the thought over in the dark. It was something quieter than that, steadier, closer to a kind of certainty, finding its footing under her for the first time in weeks. Kai stirred faintly in his sleep against Scout's warm flank. "Are you thinking of walls?" The question crossed her mind unbidden, and the plain truth sat right behind it, unspoken. "I am thinking of what the cold cannot reach." Morning brought no miracle with it. The straw still sat exactly where she had left it. The ground was still bare, the wind still cold, winter no further off than it had been the night before. And yet something in her had shifted its full weight, regardless. After Kai had eaten, she knelt on the bare earth and began drawing lines in the dirt with a stick, 14 feet by 18, room enough for a bed, a small stove, a table, a corner for a growing boy, and the dog determined to keep guarding him. Around the outline she drew the walls thick, far thicker than any cabin wall she had ever seen raised on that stretch of prairie. Bales stacked flat rather than standing upright, so their broadest faces carried the weight evenly. Joints staggered course over course, so no single seam ran clean through the whole wall. Split cedar, stakes driven straight down through several layers at once, pinning them fast together. Rawhide lashed tight at every corner. A shell of clay, worked with sand, chopped grass, and wood ash, spread thick over the outside to seal the whole structure against weather. It looked strange even to her own eye. Nothing at all like the plank cabin scattered loosely across the territory. Will it stand? The question sat there plainly, and the plain truth was that she did not yet know for certain. The wagon would not keep them both alive, clear through January. The sod would not hold together on its own. Lumber cost more than she had, or would likely ever have again before the first real snow. If straw counted as nothing but trash to everyone else in the county, it was still the one thing she happened to have more than enough of. Kai pointed at the rough drawing and wanted to know whether Scout got to sleep inside too. And for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, Litonya smiled without having to work at it. "He may be the very first to know if it is working," she promised him. and the boy nodded gravely, as though he had just been handed an important post to keep, because in his own mind he plainly had been. The building itself began the very next morning, and it did not slow for weeks after. Some of the straw came from what Warren had thrown aside behind his barn. More came from small outfits scattered across the county, where old bales sat forgotten behind sheds, and their owners were glad enough to trade them away for a day's labor mending fence or clearing brush along a creek bank. Litonya cut cedar limbs into stakes herself and split them by hand until her palms blistered, and then, slowly, calloused over. She sliced rawhide into narrow strips by lantern light, long after Kai had fallen asleep. He gathered dried grass by the armful during the day and stacked it near the work. No reminder ever needed. Scout, by his own clear estimation, contributed a great deal to the whole effort, dragging home scraps of rope and cloth nobody remembered losing, pleased each time with himself well past what the find deserved. Word of the project traveled faster across the county than the wagon ever could have carried the straw itself. Some people laughed outright at the mention of it. A rancher swore the walls would end up as cattle feed before the first hard frost arrived. Someone else predicted the first real wind would scatter the whole structure clean across 3 sections of open prairie before it ever saw a roof. Warren, predictably, seemed to relish the story more than anyone else in the county. Beggar's Barn, he started calling it, and the name caught the way names tend to catch in small places, with little else worth discussing over supper. By the close of that week, people in town were repeating it to one another without meaning any particular unkindness by it anymore. It had simply become, in everyone's mouth, what the thing had come to be known as. Hollis Bell rented her a few torn lengths of tarred canvas and entered the small charge into his account book without a word of comment, though his face carried the same careful doubt a banker wears. Watching a loan he already privately suspects he will never see repaid in full. Course by course the walls climbed steadily upward, straw stacked flat, joints staggered, cedar stakes driven deep, rawhide cinched tight at every corner. Seam. A few weeks into the work, Josiah rode back out to see the progress with his own eyes. Without asking leave of anyone, he stepped up to the unfinished wall and shoved it hard with both open hands. The straw did not give an inch under him. He shoved a second time, harder still, and received the very same answer. For a long moment he simply stood there brushing dust from his palms, and it was the closest thing to approval Litonya had yet received from a single soul in the county. It was not approval, though, not truly. Standing up in September, he pointed out, looking north toward the flat horizon, is not the same thing at all as standing up in February. Then he mounted his horse and rode off without waiting for a reply, leaving her to wonder how many people in that county measured her chances by a calendar page instead of by the wall standing directly in front of them. For a while afterward, the cabin seemed content to prove her right regardless. The walls kept rising steadily, the straw stayed dry through several passing showers, and each week the structure looked a little more like something a real family could actually shelter inside, come winter. Then autumn reminded her, the way autumn eventually reminds nearly everyone, that an idea surviving well on paper is not remotely the same thing as an idea surviving actual weather. A cold rain swept hard through the draw late one afternoon, and nothing dramatic seemed to happen while it fell. The real damage revealed itself only the following morning. Litonya stepped outside at first light and found thin cracks spreading across a wide section of the plaster, some no wider than a fingernail, others opening several inches across the exposed surface. Near the north corner, the clay had pulled back far enough to bear the straw underneath completely. Worse still, a dark stain of moisture had pooled along the base of the wall where rainwater had gathered against the foundation and simply lingered there overnight, exactly where it should never have been allowed to sit. Then Scout began scratching furiously at the north wall and barking sharp and hard, and when she pulled back a loose section herself, she found tiny bite marks threading clean through several exposed strands of straw. Mice! If moisture found its way fully into those walls, the straw inside would rot from the center out. If the mice moved in first, she would have built herself a nest rather than a shelter. Josiah's warning came back to her louder now than it had sounded the day he first put it into words. She did not spend that day arguing with herself over whether the whole design had been sound to begin with. She spent it instead changing whatever plainly needed changing. A shallow gravel trench went in all around the perimeter to carry rainwater well away from the base before it could ever pool again. Stones hauled up from the draw formed a low, protective skirt along the foundation to keep splash and runoff clear of the raw plaster itself. The mixture changed too. More sand worked through it, more wood ash, more chopped grass, folded in to strengthen the bond, and fresh rawhide sealed tight over every gap near the sill. While she worked outside in the cold, she struck a fair trade with Nora, Josiah's wife. A coat Litonya had carefully mended for Nora's young granddaughter, exchanged for a full sack of wood ash and several lengths of good old rawhide. Nora would not hear one word of thanks over what she considered a plain, even trade between neighbors. A well-sewn seam, she informed Litonya firmly, was worth a great deal more than pity, and that settled the matter entirely between the two women. Litonya set the sack down beside the wall that evening and studied it a long moment before returning to her work by lantern light. The cabin, she understood clearly now, was no longer simply an idea she had once sketched hastily into the dirt on a desperate morning. It had become, whether she had planned it or not, a genuine lesson, and lessons on that particular stretch of prairie rarely arrive without some real cost quietly attached to them. Fixing the wall solved that one problem cleanly, and did nothing whatsoever for the other still pressing on her. Building materials still cost money. She plainly did not have. Fuel cost money. Flour and salt cost money. She could barely spare. A single trip into town for a handful of nails, a sack of flour, and one badly rusted stovepipe still ran up a small debt against Hollis Bell's counter. And small debts, she was learning fast, had a habit of quietly growing larger than they ever looked at first glance. Warren had passed an offer through Hollis by then. $40 for the land outright, enough to clear her whole account, enough to rent a small room through the worst stretch of winter, enough to keep Kai warm until spring without any straw walls standing between him and the weather at all. Hollis was not cruel, laying it plainly out for her. To his mind it amounted to simple arithmetic. A person could recover, given time, from lost land. Recovering from a hard winter spent fully exposed to it was a far less certain thing to count on. Litonya listened through the whole of it, and shook her head once. No, that, and nothing more, was the entire explanation she gave him. Hollis sighed and added another careful line to his ledger. A couple of men warming themselves by the stove traded a look between them that needed no words at all. February changes a woman's mind, Hollis observed, as she reached the door not unkindly. More the way a man states a fact he has already watched prove itself true more than once before. Outside on the porch, someone leaning against the rail remarked that the stovepipe under her arm would heat the whole open sky sooner than it would ever heat a wall built out of straw, and a few of the men gathered there laughed easily along with him. Litonya kept walking without turning her head, the pipe rattling gently against the wagon side, the entire ride home through the cold. By October, what had begun as a handful of lines scratched hastily into the dirt stood above the open prairie as a real finished structure. At last the walls had reached their full intended height. Cottonwood poles braced the roof overhead, worn canvas stretched tight across the frame, and a thin cap of sod held everything firmly down against the wind. The reinforced plaster had hardened well across the entire exterior by then, and the cracks that had worried her so badly weeks earlier never once returned to trouble her again. Inside, Litonya had turned the rough shell into something that felt genuinely less like a shelter and far more like a true home. A blanket strung across divided the sleeping space. A small table stood braced against one wall. A corner belonged plainly to Kai, and a spot near the door had become Scout's, since he had personally decided the drafts there were worth guarding day and night. She hung a cracked thermometer just beside the entrance, and from that day forward, her father's old ledger took on an entirely new purpose in her hands. Every morning and every evening, without fail, she recorded the same careful handful of details: the temperature outside, the temperature within, the wind's direction, the fuel she had burned, the condition of each separate wall. On the first truly cold night, the prairie outside dropped to 24 degrees. She checked the thermometer well before sunrise and found the inside air holding steady at 39, with no fire burning at all through the night. It was not, on its own, a dramatic difference. It did not need to be dramatic. It was enough, finally, to tell her with cold numbers rather than mere hope that the walls she had built with her own two hands were doing something real, something more than simply standing upright and looking sturdy from a distance. The first true windstorm of that season struck a few days later, sweeping down hard from the north with the particular confidence of something that had never once lost a fight against anything standing in its path. Thus lifted clean off the ground, sagebrush bent flat under it, the canvas roof rattled hard enough that Scout was up on his feet and barking before Litonya had even fully registered the loose flap snapping against the roofline herself. She grabbed a coil of rawhide and stepped out into cold air that struck her like an open-hand wind, tearing hungrily at her coat, canvas cracking overhead like a whip in a rider's fist. She climbed onto the roof's edge, lashed the loose section firmly down, and packed fresh clay into a narrow gap near the gable before full darkness closed in completely around her. By the time she came back inside, her hands had gone nearly numb from the cold, and Kai had already pulled Scout close beside the stove, where buffalo chips and dried sage burned steady through the worst of it. The thermometer gave its quiet answer for that particular night: 16 degrees below zero outside, 47 comfortably within. Beyond the walls, the wind sounded fierce enough to strip paint clean off a barn door somewhere. Inside, it faded down into something closer to a distant, almost forgettable murmur. Beneath the evening's numbers, she wrote one short line into her father's book: north wall held, roof edge loosened, fixed well before dark. Kai watched her finish the entry and wondered whether the wind had gotten in at all that night. She pressed her palm flat against the nearest wall to check for herself. The plaster felt cool beneath her hand. The air around them plainly did not. Not enough to matter, she assured him gently. Outside, the prairie kept fighting the same old fight it always fought. Inside, still air was quietly, steadily starting to win. Warren rode out 3 days after that storm, and the purpose behind his visit sat plain on his face, well before he had even climbed fully down from his horse. He wanted to see the failure with his own eyes, and he arrived already, smirking faintly at the low sod roof and the uneven plaster, the old nickname sitting ready on his tongue before he had even crossed the threshold. "Quite a beggar's barn," he sneered, stepping inside uninvited, but something interrupted whatever else he had planned to say next. The air inside was noticeably warmer. Not comfortable, exactly, not impressive by any standard he would readily admit to out loud, simply, undeniably warmer than the open prairie he had just ridden in from. He clearly noticed it. He simply refused, on principle, to say so out loud to her face. "A box of straw can fool a man for a few short weeks," he informed her instead, glancing around the small room as though searching openly for the trick hidden somewhere in it. "That does not make it a proper house." Litonya did not argue the point with him at all. Her father's ledger sat open on the shelf exactly where she had left it, columns of fresh numbers filling its newest pages, temperatures, wind directions, Fuel burned faithfully night after night through the season. Warren flipped idly through several entries himself, frowning slightly. "Numbers won't stop February," he pointed out. She glanced once toward the wall beside the stove before answering him at all. Walls might. She let the two words sit between them far longer than either of them had quite expected. Kai avoided his uncle's eyes for the whole of the visit, and when Warren wanted to know whether the boy missed the old house even a little, Kai stayed silent. Scout stepped bodily between the two of them and gave a low, steady growl that nobody in the room bothered commenting on. A few minutes later, Warren mounted back up and started off down the slope toward home, and halfway down he stopped his horse and looked back once over his shoulder, not laughing this time, only looking, truly looking, at the small cabin as though for the very first time since she had begun raising it. The circuit preacher came through not long after that, carrying a small paper sack of dried apples for Kai and speaking gently. The practiced way men of his calling generally do when they have come to smooth something over rather than settle it plainly. Families, he explained to her carefully, sometimes accepted hard arrangements simply to avoid deeper bitterness or costly lawsuits, or a division that never fully healed afterward. Litonya let him finish the whole thought before asking, quite plainly, whether he himself had ever actually read the deed. For a long moment he gave nothing back at all, his eyes drifting toward the stove instead, and that particular silence carried more than any spoken answer possibly could have. He had read it clearly. He understood exactly what had been done to her that autumn. The real trouble had never been that people failed to understand her situation. The trouble was that Warren owned the land outright. Warren controlled credit at the only store in town. Warren employed half the men in the county in one season or another. And Litonya, for all her effort, owned only a straw cabin that had not yet truly faced down a real Kansas winter. A hard gust struck the north wall while the two of them talked, and the wall itself simply absorbed the blow without complaint. "I pray this holds," the preacher ventured quietly, watching the wall the careful way a man watches something he does not yet fully trust. Litonya, smoothing a patch of fresh plaster near the doorway with her thumb, let him know plainly that prayer was always welcome. "So was plaster," she added, and something close to a genuine smile crossed his face before he caught himself and let it fade again. January arrived, carrying a warning with it rather than any final verdict. One morning, well before sunrise, Litonya checked the thermometer and found the prairie outside sitting at 8 below zero, the cabin itself holding steady at 53. She wrote it all down carefully. One pan of buffalo chips and sage burned through the night, the north wall dry, the south wall tight, and the entry looked almost unbelievable, set down plainly in ink, like that. Across the county, other families were feeding their stoves around the clock without rest, watching drafts slip steadily through the seams of ordinary frame walls, watching their wood piles shrink faster than anyone could reasonably replace them. Inside the straw cabin, the fuel stack stayed noticeably larger than Litonya had dared to expect, and she noticed the difference before she quite let herself trust it fully. Small things had shifted too, quieter than any number on a page. One evening, spreading his blanket out by the wall, Kai referred to the cabin simply as our house, without appearing to notice he'd spoken anything worth remarking on at all. Litonya gave no answer in reply, only kept stirring the pot steady over the stove, though something eased quietly in her chest at the plain sound of it. January had proven a great deal to her by then. It had not yet proven everything there was left to prove. That same night, Scout left his warm spot by the stove and stood facing the door, instead, ears pricked hard toward the north, listening at something none of the rest of them could hear just yet. Before I tell you what came for them that February, if Litonya's stubbornness reminds you of your own, become a member of this channel. Tap join beside the channel name. It helps more than you'd think. Whatever Scout had been listening for out in that freezing dark finally showed itself. The 12th of February, 1888, arrived beneath a sky the exact color of old iron. Litonya noticed the change well before sunrise. The borrowed barometer hanging by the door had been falling steadily since midnight, slowly, at first, then faster with each passing hour. By the time she had fed Kai his breakfast, the needle had dropped far enough to erase whatever thin optimism January had managed to leave standing. At noon, the storm finally struck in full. A north wind slammed hard across the draw with such raw force that falling snow never once got the chance to properly settle. It raced sideways instead in blinding white sheets, blotting the horizon out completely in every direction at once. The temperature began collapsing fast. 21 degrees, then 3, then 11 below, within the space of only a few hours, the sky itself seeming determined to erase the whole remaining distance between Earth and itself. Inside, Litonya moved with the same careful, unhurried method she had relied on through the entire winter. Already she checked the rawhide gasket at the door one more time. She pressed fresh clay firmly into the narrow gap near the gable. She pulled the fuel closer in toward the stove and checked the pipe twice over for good measure. Nothing she did that day was rushed. Nothing was careless. She kept Kai wrapped snug in blankets and her own voice steady throughout, and let no visible fear into it that she could help at all. Scout stayed pressed by the door, lifting his head sharply toward the north wall every few minutes, as the wind hammered the small cabin in slow, deliberate waves, first one impact, then another, close behind it, then a third, the roof groaning overhead, the canvas tightening and releasing by turns, snow hissing hard against the outer walls without pause. But the walls themselves never once shuddered, the way an ordinary frame house surely would have under that same weight. Their sheer thickness spread the force of every gust evenly across the whole shell at once, rather than letting it concentrate against any single weak seam. The pressure arrived. The pressure stayed a long while. The pressure moved steadily on through and past them, and inside the thermometer held firm at 55 degrees, then 52, well above anything a person could honestly call dangerous. Litonya recorded each fresh number with fingers gone stiff from the deep cold, while outside the barometer kept falling further, and the wind kept climbing higher still. A particularly hard gust struck close to sunset, hard enough that Kai looked up sharply from his blanket and wanted to know whether the whole house might blow clean away. She listened a moment, not to the raging storm outside, but to the walls themselves, standing firm around them. It has weight now, she assured him simply, resting her open palm flat against the cool plaster beside her. Beyond the door the blizzard kept coming without any sign of slowing, and the hardest stretch of it, she understood clearly, had not even properly arrived yet. The first knock came sometime well after full dark, so faint at first that the howling wind very nearly swallowed the sound of it whole. Scout heard it before she did, and was up on his feet barking, hard at the door within seconds. Litonya threw the latch back, and a blast of frozen air came rushing in alongside the three figures standing beyond the threshold. Josiah, Nora, and their young granddaughter, wrapped tight in blankets, gone stiff through, with ice frost thick and white across their eyebrows. Josiah's own house was still standing back home, technically, but that question had plainly stopped mattering hours earlier. Wind had been finding its patient way through his ordinary frame walls for most of the night already. His stove burned constantly, and the temperature inside kept right on falling anyway, no matter what he fed it. Litonya stepped back from the doorway without a single word and simply let the three of them in. Nobody standing in that room that night had the time or any real inclination left to discuss pride. An hour later, Scout barked again sharply, and this time the figure waiting at the door was one Litonya, recognized instantly by silhouette alone. Warren stood out there in the deep darkness with none of his usual confidence left anywhere in him, snow lying heavy across both shoulders, his lips gone faintly blue from prolonged cold. Behind him stood his wife and both of his children, huddled close together. The roof over part of his grain shed had caved clean in under the accumulated snow. He managed through chattering teeth, and the main farmhouse itself had grown flatly impossible. To keep warm through the night, ice had already begun forming along the rim of a water bucket sitting indoors near the stove. Warren guided his own family through the door, ahead of himself first, then stopped dead on the threshold, one boot still planted outside in the storm, looking for one long moment like a man who genuinely no longer knew whether he still belonged inside that particular room. Whatever words he had privately meant to say never quite made it out of him at all. Litonya did not wait around for them regardless. She reached out, took hold of the front of his coat with both hands, and pulled him bodily through the doorway, then shut the raging storm firmly back out into the dark where it plainly belonged. Space grew precious fast after that, with so many bodies suddenly crowded under one small roof. Fuel had to be recalculated on the spot, right there in the moment. More bodies meant more warmth generated between them, certainly, but also far more demanded of the little wood and dried chips she had carefully stacked by the stove for the season. Wet coats were hung well back away from the walls to dry. Slowly the stove received close, steady attention through the long night. The door opened only when there was truly no way around it. Everyone sat pressed close together through the endless hours that followed, while the wind went right on hammering the small cabin without any real pause between gusts. At some point deep in that long night, Kai began coughing lightly. Not badly, just often enough to make Litonya glance toward the shrinking fuel pile and quietly do the hard arithmetic in her own head. Still, nobody crowded into that small room ever once suggested leaving for safer ground elsewhere. Nobody mentioned the old nickname aloud. Nobody so much as whispered about the laughter that had trailed this cabin faithfully all the way from September through to that very night. The same walls that had been openly mocked for months as a beggar's barn were, on that particular night, the only thing standing firm between every single person, sheltered inside them, and a prairie fully determined to kill them all before morning, and the blizzard everyone in that room understood clearly. The storm finally loosened its grip on the morning of the third day. Sunlight returned first, pale and thin, and then came the silence after it. After nearly 3 full days of relentless wind, the sheer absence of sound felt almost wrong somehow, like something the whole world had simply forgotten how to do properly. Litonya opened the door at last and stepped out into a landscape that had entirely vanished beneath fresh snow. Drifts reached clear up to the lower edge of the windows. Fence lines had disappeared completely from sight. Even ground she had walked 100 times over that winter looked genuinely foreign to her. Now the thermometer gave its final number for that whole storm. 32 degrees below zero, plain and stark. Inside the cabin still held firm at 49, nobody gathered in that room would have named the temperature comfortable by any honest measure. Comfort, she reminded herself, had never once been the true point of any of it from the very start. Everyone under that roof was alive, and on that particular gray morning, that fact alone was the whole of what genuinely mattered to any of them. Kai's cough had faded away to almost nothing by then. Scout stretched himself out lazily beside the stove and yawned wide, as though the previous 3 days had amounted to little more than a minor inconvenience already worth forgetting entirely. 2, one by one after that, her unexpected guests began quietly preparing to leave for their own homes. Before Josiah swung himself back up onto his horse, he stopped beside the cabin wall and rested one open hand flat against the plaster for a long, thoughtful moment. This was the very same man who had once argued so firmly for studs and tar paper and every last convention of an ordinary frame cabin, and he studied the wall now with an entirely different expression settled across his weathered face. "How much ash did you work into this particular plaster mixture?" he wanted to know, the first genuinely technical question he had ever put directly to her, and it would plainly not be the last one either. She met each question fully, and another followed close behind it, and another after that one too. Nora exchanged a quiet glance with Litonya that needed no spoken words behind it at all. Certain hard lessons, once truly lived all the way through, simply go on to explain themselves afterward. The roads out of the draw opened slowly over the days that followed the storm. The circuit preacher eventually made his own way out to the claim and found Warren standing quietly outside the cabin, staring hard at its walls. In a silence the preacher wisely chose not to interrupt right away. For a long moment, neither man gave anything at all, both of them simply studying a structure that by every rule either had ever privately believed in should never have survived what it had just plainly survived intact. Warren broke the silence himself eventually, his voice low. "Father would have known how to build something like this," he admitted quietly, not quite meeting the preacher's eye. Litonya, standing near the doorway close enough to hear him clearly, gave only this in reply. She had written some of it down for him already. Nature, she felt, had already settled whatever arguments still lingered stubbornly between the two of them, and there was little left worth adding to it now. Spring arrived several weeks later across the draw, and the cabin was still standing firm when it finally did. So, it turned out, were the questions people had slowly started bringing to her door in place of laughter. Neighbors began asking her about the gravel trench, about the exact plaster mixture, about the low stone skirt running along the base of the wall. Some wanted a hand with a shed of their own, others with a proper chicken house. One family further off wanted a storeroom dug and braced tight before next winter could ever catch them the same way it had so nearly caught her that February. Litonya never once treated any of the knowledge as something worth guarding jealously to herself. She showed each of them the trench, the cedar stakes, the stone skirt, the reinforced plaster, and above everything else, she carefully explained the one central idea that had truly started all of it in the beginning: the plain, quiet value of still air, trapped and simply left alone to do its own patient work through the coldest months. The old nickname outlived the mockery that had once traveled everywhere alongside it. People still knew it as the beggar's barn around the county, some purely out of long habit by then, a few even fondly. The one real difference, the only difference that ever genuinely mattered in the end, was that nobody laughed anymore whenever they happened to say it. One quiet evening after the last visitor of that particular day had ridden off toward home, and the cabin had settled fully back into stillness around her, Litonya opened her father's ledger one final time before winter fully released its hold on the county. Near the bottom of the last full page sat the entry she had written down during the very worst hour of the whole storm, February 14th, north wind. House held. She let her eyes rest there a long while before finally closing the worn book for the season, not like a woman celebrating some hard-won victory over anyone else at all, but like a woman who had simply, quietly outlasted a season that had never once truly believed she would. Clearly, and without needing to announce it to a single soul left in that county, exactly what she was fully capable of building with nothing more than her own two steady hands.